Well, maybe we'll go ahead and get started. Just a couple of adjustments here on my screen. So, greetings, everyone. Welcome to this session. We're so happy to have you all with us here tonight. My name is Tom Fleischner. My pleasure to be the host here tonight. I am the Senior Advisor and Director Emeritus of the Natural History Institute based here in Prescott, Arizona. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the Institute for those who are not familiar with it. The Institute is a mission-based independent nonprofit organization based here in the Mogollon Highlands ecoregion of Northern Arizona. That mission is the Natural History Institute provides leadership and resources for a revitalized practice of natural history that integrates art, science, and humanities to promote the health and well-being of humans and the rest of the natural world. Or simply put, the mission is to sort of foster love and understanding of the world. If you're not familiar with our programs, we encourage you to come on and check out our website, naturalhistoryinstitute.org, which there's all sorts of resources, including information about upcoming programs, which you can subscribe to that list. We also have a very active YouTube channel, which you can also subscribe to. I wanted to just highlight a couple upcoming programs that I think some of you might be interested in. Next Thursday, 1 week from tonight, we have a really exciting program that is both in person here in Arizona and also be live streaming everywhere, called by Dr. Erin McGee. We'll be talking about Find That Lizard, Ecology, Science Outreach, and Social Justice in STEM. And Jesse Rack, our program director, who's our magician behind the scenes here, is putting the link to that registration in the chat function right now. In 2 weeks, we'll be having a really exciting program with celebrating the publication of a new book. And that program is called Science and Poetry of the Sierra Nevada with Richard Neville, who's actually with us here tonight, and Stephen Nightingale. Really excited about that one. And thought I also might mention an upcoming natural history river trip in southern Utah in early May to just give you a sense of the breadth of what we're doing. And there's much more that you can check out on our website. So welcome to the Natural History Institute community. And if you like what we're doing, we welcome you for more programs and also invite your support of these programs, because like any small nonprofit, we're dependent on that support. Just wanted to say something about the Zoom sort of protocols for tonight. As we have been encouraging you to say hello in the chat, but here in just a minute, we're going to be turning that chat function off, just because we've found that it's quite distracting sometimes when the chat function is going on and on throughout the actual presentation and discussions. However, we will at the same time, the Q&A, the question and answer function is live, and we will be encouraging you to use that, and we'll be drawing on your questions and comments later on in the program. So at any time, you can add a comment or a question in that Q&A function. Also might mention that when you do that, if you see somebody else has already said essentially what you were going to say, just use the thumbs up function to say yes, 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 and that way we see what's really important. Hey, Jane, great to see that you're here as well. And also wanted to let you know that the program will be archived immediately on the Natural History Institute YouTube channel. So it'll be actually cleaned up a little bit in the morning to take off just the first couple of minutes while we're all filing in. But if you want to share this program with other people, you can do that quite easily at any time. So that said, it's my really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary Power, our guest of honor this evening. Mary, so much we can say about her. Mary's a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at University of California, Berkeley. She's also for many years been the faculty director of the Angelo Coast Range Reserve in the wonderful University of California Reserve System, which is just a wonderful thing. Among the many other honors that she has received, Mary is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of the California Academy of Sciences. She's the past president of both the Ecological Society of America and the American Society of Naturalists. Her work was profiled in a feature film called Serengeti Rules, which you can find online and which I highly recommend you check out. A number of other great ecologists featured there as well. Just a few years ago, there was a big review article that came out called 100 Articles Every Ecologist Should Read. And Mary was one of the authors of one of those key papers. Some other people that you may have heard of, a guy named Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, were some of the others. So Mary is held in very, very high regard. And also closer to home, very happy to say that very pleased that Mary is a member of the Natural History Institute's National Advisory Council, and we really appreciate her support. And most important to me, she's my friend. So my friend, Mary, welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's really great to have you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And just wanted to say one thing. Natural history as a term is sometimes misunderstood, or understood in different ways, and just thought I would say, for the purposes of our discussion here tonight, here at the Natural History Institute, we consider natural history to be the practice of intentional, focused attentiveness to the more than human world, guided by accuracy and honesty. Perhaps a more expansive definition than sometimes you may be familiar with. So, Mary, I'll stop babbling. We want to hear from you. And so maybe to start, can you just describe a little bit for us about your personal pathway to becoming an internationally recognized scientist, and perhaps trace the path of your sort of falling in love with the world as a child and beyond, and tell us a little bit about how that all worked, and how your interest and your passions towards the outer world were, and perhaps in some cases were not, nurtured. So yeah.
It's a fun question to reflect on. I think I was very lucky in my parents, especially my father. My father grew up in a homestead in the panhandle of Idaho, born in 1910. So he was there when it was really outside the law, really just homesteads. And he literally grew up on a dirt floor in a one-room cabin with the rooms just divided by blankets. So very primitive conditions. And there were no other little kids there. So his friends, he told me about this as he grew older. His friends were the trout in the streams and the mice that he found and could adopt. And so he was maybe not a lonely little kid, but a kid whose friendships were not human, more than human, you would say.
Yeah.
So I remember one of my first memories is being on his shoulders and picking black walnuts in Ohio, and then also being in a rowboat with him and catching painted turtles and putting them in an old inner tube in the middle of the rowboat, just temporarily. We released them, but I got to jump over the side of the boat and go catch them and bring them back. And I know that was before age 4, because we moved from the Ohio at that age. So we moved every 4 years of my life, and I took maybe about 4 years to make friends. So I too spent a lot of time alone in the woods and loved it. And I grew up in large part along in the fork of 2 rivers, where our little subdivision house was positioned between a natural creek in the outskirts of St. Louis, in a suburb that was eventually to crawl over the entire forest there. And I spent a lot of time in that creek and just had so many adventures. The other tributary, which was the other edge of our lot, was actually just a drainage ditch and conduit under a street, but it was full of mystery, and also crayfish and occasional water moccasins. And it was just really fun. So I always could forget any human cares, even from a very young age, by watching and thinking about animals. And what I thought about a lot and worried about a lot was, how do they ever get enough to eat? So I was asking that question when I was between 6 and 8 years old. I was very worried, especially how did birds get through the winter on the little bare feet and not many seeds, or how do other creatures make it? And that turned out to be what I do. I do foraging ecology primarily. So I guess I was very lucky in getting a career out of that. I didn't go to graduate school to learn academics. I went to try to get society to pay me to be in a clear tropical habitat for at least 2 and maybe 3 years, living underwater.
I think that may be the motivation for a whole lot of us once people are honest.
Yeah. I did that. Also, the water part was important because my being very nearsighted wasn't recognized. And so I remember a flashbulb moment when I saw everything very clearly when I first had a mask on and saw actually coastal marine seaweeds and snails and crabs and fish underwater. So, but at the time I was starting my graduate work in the mid 70s, there had been a lot of great work done on coral reefs. I'd got to see a coral reef and just was blown away. Would have loved to have worked on them, but many other good ecologists were working on them. And nobody in particular was working in clear freshwaters with the approach of snorkeling and directly observing the lives of fishes and other things underwater. So that's what I got to do for 3 years. And just watching what the fish do came first, but then University of Washington was a very interesting place and people threw ideas out and those ideas were exciting. This is the theory part, because sometimes what an armored catfish does, you can interpret it more, or maybe you can use it to predict. It's a grazing system. So they live in pools. They're reluctant to leave because of danger in the shallow riffles from fishing birds. And so they have to regraze sites. And so there's all sorts of theory. This gets beyond just looking at the armored catfish, but there's all sorts of theory from swidden agriculture to grazing, great stock management, and some systems in benthic marine grazers like with owl libbets. There's all this interesting thinking about what return time means. If you come back to a site too early, there won't be enough food. If you come back too late, somebody else may have gotten your food, or it could have just degraded in the case of the Panama because of silt. So you think about those fish, you think very hard about what they need, what they have to do. And then that leads to questions that explain their distribution and abundance, or how size classes interact, or how they interact with the productivity of their resource, which becomes more general, hopefully.
That's so fascinating, and you're kind of anticipating in a way sort of where I was interested in going, which is trying to sort of look at the relationship and perhaps tease apart a little bit the relationship between sort of observational natural history, as we've defined it as a practice of attentiveness, and then the sort of ecological theory. And you just gave an example of how those were related for you in a particular cases. Is there any other examples like that you might share of? I guess I'm interested to hear from you, who's been, I know you're adamant that you are not a theorist per se, but you've certainly been done a lot of work that has had important theoretical implications. It's been widely cited by others for theoretical purposes and so on, and you're interested in theory. So looking at the linkage between the practice of natural history and the development of theory that sort of changes the way we perceive the world is structured. Does that make
Yes, it
make
does.
sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, you could start if you start with your empathy and your attentive observation, which you emphasize in your work and thinking. And if you're empathizing, you wonder what they do about food and fear. That's going back to that. And so I have to say, I was very interested, but maybe because of the intrinsic myopia, and also ecologists tend to do this. We tend to, especially experimental folks, at least in the earlier days, we tended to look at our feet a lot rather than looking at bigger pictures. So I would say, here's a story to how some of my work led to theory that required the intervention of my husband. So Bill took me down to Panama, and we did what everybody should do. If you don't have a question, you don't have a hypothesis, just go ahead and map your habitat. So he under his guidance, we mapped it so that we could know how much area of habitat the catfish had in the dry season, and then in the rainy season when the base flow was about 20 centimeters higher. And so that involved months and months of tedious mapping with homemade survey equipment. But at the end, then I was starting to do these renewal rates and how fast is the algae growing and how fast does it silt up, and do the fish come back too early or too late or just right. So that was a kind of a close focus study to look at what happens to sites over square meters. But when we were going up and down these kilometers of streams that we mapped together, Bill then said, well, Mary, how many fish are in that pool? And I said, oh, well, it's about half shaded, so it's got an intermediate light level, and there's about 22 square meters of grazable substrate. So I'd say 44, 45, and I'd snorkel it and there would be 43. It was, so he told me that on this large hundreds of meters habitat scale, I had a way to predict densities and distributions. And then that, I already knew just from worrying about these fish and living with them. Actually, a couple of years I lived with these fish for a couple of years, which was very satisfying to me, but not really getting so far on my thesis, right? except that I really understood the scales over which they operated. And so this led to a very strong support for a great idea that Steve Fretwell had. So Steve Fretwell was an ecologist based in Kansas who studied birds, and he thought about ideal free distributions, which are not shown too much except at very small scales in nature. It's like, if you feed fish food to goldfish at rate X on one side of the aquarium and rate 2X on the other side of the aquarium, you had 8 goldfish, then you're going to have double the number over on the 2X side. So that means they track the renewal rate of their foods, and therefore they flatten it out in terms of the instantaneous biomass. So that's exactly what these armored catfish were doing. Once I recognized that they were grazing light-limited algae, and I could predict that algae were growing fast in sunny pools and slow in dark pools, then the fish were adjusting their densities. Just because they left when they were hungry and they kept sampling enough.
I just want to hop in, Mary, for just a second. It's like, since some people who are here with us tonight are not clear of the whole picture of what you were doing with catfish in Panama, can you just
can
you just sort of say what the question was you were trying to answer, or just so everybody has the context.
These are armored catfish, and the reason I really started studying them is they looked like ostracoderm, so I could pretend I was back in the Devonian.
In other words, they were cool. They
were very cool.
Which I think is actually the way a lot of...
That's absolutely wrong. They're very recently derived, very advanced fish, very smart fish, actually.
Yeah.
So,
but I think that's actually the way a lot of natural history practice works, is our attention gets grabbed by something, whether it's beautiful, whether it's interesting, whether it's unusual, and then we dig in. And
then you pay a little bit closer attention, and you see how your initial impressions were wrong. But it was back to that childhood questions. How do they get enough to eat? There are 6 armored catfish for square meters in sunny pools. The rock substrates that they graze, they have these, those of you who kept them in aquaria know they have these sucker-like mouths, and they have to make a seal, and then the coma-like tooth plates work off the algae. But because they have to seal, they have to graze flat substrates. And that makes it possible to measure the area of the substrates they graze, because it's either the big old logs or mostly the flat bedrock platforms. So, but there isn't any visible food. They graze it so closely that the rocks aren't even slippery. So how in the world can 6 per square meter be supported? And then the other question is, are they tracking their food where it's really available? And if not, why not? So I was just going through this kind of this theory thing about how on a pool to pool scale, and for those of you who don't spend a lot of time underwater in streams, when you have a meandering stream, it's like beads on a string. You have a sequence of pool habitats separated by shallow riffles, and the pools are habitats for big organisms that are in danger from fishing birds or mammals if they get caught in the riffles. But the riffles are habitats and nurseries for the little guys who are in danger if they go through the wall of mouths that are in the pools. So everybody's sorted out by fear there. And if you see a little guy trying to go from one riffle to another, he just skirts the very narrow edge of the pool, trying not to get eaten. So that's, and then you have this replication. So you can look at pools that are shaded, pools that are sunny, pools that are intermediate, and get a sample size so you can look at more than one. And so that's why meandering rivers should be the most commonly studied theater in ecology, because they're so conveniently replicated. And then every once in a while, if you want to see how things reassemble, the tablecloth gets shaken by floods and then it reassembles. So you can get repetition in time. So does the community build up in the same way year after year, or are there differences? So all of those are the inconvenient part, is that your experiments can end up in the treetops, which has happened to me on many occasions. But that's the way it works. And for the foraging ecology, the question was, can they track their food? And if not, why not? So they tracked it extremely closely on this pool to pool scale over kilometers, but in any pool, you'd see an emerald bathtub ring of algae that's went from the river's edge, the water, down to about 20 centimeters. And that was because they were scared of birds in the 20 centimeter depth. So where fishing birds or mammals are threats, the fish can play the long game because they can starve a long time without dying. And at 20 centimeters, they get enough warning between the splash and the strike that they can get out. But if they're shallower, the heron can nab them. And I occasionally saw very sad little cleaned out shells of armored catfish that had been eaten by raptorial birds. So they don't track food along a depth gradient. And then I've done, Michael Parker, who's here, was a wonderful colleague and partner, looking at whether watershed creatures like spiders, lizards, and bats track food over the scales. And a lot of their food is emerging and then flying out of the river into, in our case, kind of old growth Doug fir and redwood forest, but that's not very edible vegetation. So a lot of those insectivores were really tracking river production. And there are reasons that some of the spiders tracked it and others didn't. Michael studied filmy dome spiders that didn't track the flux of bugs, the bug flux, we called it, that was highest near the water's edge. And these filmy dome spiders invest so much silk that they don't care to move after they've built their webs as much as other types of spiders. And so he found that the spiders near the river were fat and their webs were small. And then 500 meters up the hill, the spiders were skinny and their webs were beach ball size. So a lot more effort and a lot less payoff. But everybody else was tracking the flux, the bats and the lizards and birds. So that's just another, if you ask those really fundamental questions that matter to the lives of the animals, if the spiders are tracking their food, what are the consequences? And if they're not, why aren't they? And what are those consequences? So then you get into theory, because these balances between food and fear matter for every animal, every conscious organism.
Yeah. So just to sort of recap some of that a little bit, it seems like back so it seems like so much of what has been this sterling professional career has been based on some of the same passions and insights that you had when you were a very young child.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
which is really neat. And earlier on when you were talking, you actually used the term myopia, and I just want to make clear that for those some may not be clear that you were using that literally, that
Yes,
you
these
couldn't
these are pretty
that was not a
glasses.
metaphor.
Nearsightedness. Yeah.
And so you actually weren't used to seeing things so clearly, and then you went underwater and suddenly you could, and that opened up this whole new world. And so that uh, that sort of childhood history really kind of set you on this direction of looking and seeing. And then it seems as though earlier you used the word empathy, and it seems as though that too is what you're suggesting is a key aspect ultimately of being a successful theoretical scientist, is having enough empathy, not just for all of the good and important reasons about being good stewards of the world and so on, but also it helps you be a better thinker in a way, because you're thinking about those organisms that you're studying in a way that is not just thinking of them as sort of inert actors in a play or something.
Right. They're not here to verify your theory.
Right.
That would be so. Your gift of a title for our session, the respectful roots of ecological theory, is I really like it, because it's part of the respect that we hear from when we listen to many indigenous folks, that you respect something by being attentive to it, by being honest and trying to take in what lessons it has, how it lives his, hers, their lives. And then you try to reflect on what you learn. So you interviewed, I think, Tyson Yunkaporta, and and also you've interviewed Jane Hirschfield. And Jane, when we first got to know each other, I think it might've been the first time we had a meal together, she looked up at me and said, well, do you think there's any understanding without empathy? One of those mind-blowing, no, but I never thought of it that way before.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you,
Jane's
Jane.
here with us tonight.
Thank you for many gifts. But so Yunkaporta, Australian Aboriginal, but I've heard the same ideas or feelings expressed by North American Native people and First Nations, that you respect a friend or a new culture, maybe a village that you're getting to know, or a more than human being, the hazel bush or the lizard, by being vigilant and close, attentive observation, doing the natural history, and then you connect with it. The idea that I so love, that if you've harvested part of the hazel bush for basket materials, you make life good for that bush on its other side.
Yeah.
So that that reciprocity that Robin Kimmerer talks about so much. So the respect, connect, of course, listening to a person is connecting. Then reflect on what you learn, because Tyson Roberts emphasizes that we need to be permeable. And this is something I've heard from Jane and her practice of being too, is be permeable so that a lot of the world can enter you and you can notice it. And then, so that's your reflecting on what you learn by being that way and learning to be that way. And then the next thing that in Tyson Yunkaporta's list is to direct. Then maybe you make a modification, you make a change if it's needed. If you think it would be helpful, then you can change something. And so the sequence is respect, connect, reflect, and direct. And he learned that from his aunties when he was sojourning across Australia. I just learned this from reading his wonderful book, Sand Talk, recently. But I've thought about it a lot, because that's how you can screw things up a little bit by following what his auntie says is the way white guys do it, white people. They do the same four things, but in the opposite order.
That's a great insight.
and so that, but also, they're talking about maybe the Anglosphere imposing their will on Aboriginal resources or cultures. But I've reflected that that's what we get wrong when we go out to nature looking for a system in which to test my theory. If you do that too much, then you're going to shove nature into this Procrustean box and you won't have nearly as much fun. You won't learn the surprises. And we can also do it wrong with applications. Just get under the hood and fix it. Just fix it. Well, if you do the wrong fix in the wrong part of the landscape or at the wrong time of year, you might make a bigger problem. So there's this period of respect, which is doing exactly what your definition of natural history is, to be attentive for a prolonged period and not judgmental, but honest and as accurate as possible.
Right. Yeah. The honest and accurate part is to sort of avoid projecting our preconceptions onto the world, which can happen very much, not just from scientists, but from people, very well-intentioned people. So I'm going to jump in here for just a second and invite everyone in the audience again and remind folks that the Q&A function is open and working. We invite you to go ahead and put any questions or comments you have for Mary on there, and we'll be getting to those in just a little bit here. This idea of respect, I think, is so crucial, as you just said, and as you articulated very nicely there, how it is actually part of the practice of natural history when done well, and I guess I wanted to look at that in terms of as you well know, and as I'm sure many people in our audience know, that within academia in the last few decades, say, natural history sort of fell on hard times, you might say, where it was in fact, I've sometimes said that for a long time in academia, you rarely heard the term natural history unless it was preceded by the word just, as in, well, that's just natural history. And I think that has been changing in the last few years, fortunately. But at many universities, especially large research universities, field biologists and natural historians, when they would retire, would often be replaced with more laboratory-oriented scientists and so on. And so was sort of a marginalizing of natural history within the academy, you might say. But at the same time, I think sometimes naturalists and field naturalists may have disregarded some of the importance of sort of theoretical advances in ecology to their own observations. And so you're somebody who has your feet so firmly planted in both those worlds of sort of field natural history based on empathy, based on respect, and doing this work which has major theoretical implications. And I just be interested in your sort of reflections on that dynamic and what you've seen. You've been at a major university for many years, and so I guess one part of that is how do you are you optimistic about natural history sort of regaining a seat at the table within academia, and how do we sort of erase the false dichotomy, you might say?
Yeah, I am optimistic. There's a short story to tell you about Rita Caldwell, who became the director of the National Science Foundation. But when she was just finishing her dissertation work, she had discovered that cholera, Vibrio have a free living stage in the ocean in which they piggyback on copepods and eat, or especially around the heads of the copepods. They probably are eating carbon from the crumbs of copepod feeding. But none of the medical establishment believed her. So she had a lot of trouble getting her thesis accepted, getting her papers published for several years until she
This is the
finally,
future director of the National
future
Science
director of the
Foundation.
National Science Foundation, exactly right. And then when she finally got incontrovertible proof, probably DNA was involved, that those were Vibrio cholera on copepods in the offshore zooplankton, that made her able to, she and her Bangladeshi colleagues could predict when cholera would strike Bangladesh from a phytoplankton bloom as monitored from space, NASA color imagery.
Oh.
So that's the power. But see, and at that point, it's not natural history anymore. So the cynical answer is, once it becomes really important to humans, it's not just natural history, but it started that way, right?
Yeah.
And you can think of other examples, but I have a more positive story. I did my academic training as the molecular wars were pretty virulent. So E.O. Wilson talks about molecular wars where the molecular biologists were coming into his lab right at the peak of his own career, measuring his benches to see if their mass specs would fit on them and whether they wanted to place them or not. So that was infuriating. And then many of us were bent out of shape by the quote, if it's true for E. coli, it's true for elephants. But, as I've gotten to know more about Jacob Benod and their amazing theory, and Sean, I can't believe I'm blanking on Sean's last name, the Serengeti Rules author.
Oh,
Carroll. Sorry, Sean. Sean Carroll really got it right too. The people who started looking into even molecular genetics started seeing cascades of interactions and enormous complexity. And the more molecular biologists, molecular geneticists, or cell biologists have looked, the more astonishing tangled bank level complexity there is in there. But the thing that's making me optimistic about natural history is they're starting to be able to do natural history inside living cells. Our friend Barbara Meyer has a microscope that lets her visualize molecules and atoms. And I should tell you about what Jane Marks and Bruce run the ECOS, the Environmental Center for Ecosystem Studies at Northern Arizona University. And they have an arts and science project that I think you collaborate with a fair amount. But Jane has, and her colleagues together, can take this amazing diatom, which is incredibly nutritious, but maybe it should be toxic because it has endosymbiotic cyanobacteria that live inside it. And cyanos can sometimes take nitrogen out of the sky and fix it into ammonia that then other plants and bacteria in the food web can use. But sometimes they fix it into toxins, which are nitrogen rich. But this guy fixes it into amino acids. So it's crazy, crazy nutritious diatom. And she can label with a heavy isotope the atmospheric nitrogen, follow it into the diatom and into that endosymbiotic spheroid, the cyanobacteria that have lived inside this diatom for 15 million years ancestrally. And then she can follow it into the cytoplasm of the diatom. And then she can follow it as it leaks into the matrix and gets into a neighboring diatom that doesn't fix nitrogen. So she can watch this atom actually make its way through a food web. And we don't know how far we can do that, but maybe we'll get it into a rotifer or a paramecium or something. But that tiny little food web, then you have to scale up with other techniques. But see, that is natural history. It's where's the food coming from? Who's getting it? How does this cell die? What makes this cell happy and growing at a fast rate? So all of these things they're doing inside for medical research too. They've learned a lesson, a natural history lesson that's decade old or more now, is that a lot of antibiotic resistance is because these bacteria on our body surfaces are cowering under a mucus sheath. And then they're doing all this communication, cross-feeding and stuff. And so there's huge complexity and wonder, of course, in that tiny intracellular world. And so there's natural history at all scales of organization. And
what you just
the
described sounds not dissimilar to your river systems that you
It
studied.
isn't. It isn't. As the cell biologists and the geneticists are coping with the really important functions that underlay life, then they're dealing with natural history and discovery and complexity and ecology.
Yeah, I mean, you've brought up a number of things there. And again, I want to invite people to use the Q&A function if you're so inclined to post a question or comment for Mary. Well, a couple of things there. One, you mentioned E.O. Wilson in the context of those molecular biology versus field biology wars back a few decades ago, and I was struck when you were recounting your personal story of the myopia playing such a role in what you ended up spending your life studying. Of course, the same thing was true for him because of a vision problem. That's how he ended up focusing on ants.
It's true. Yeah.
I also have always been struck by with him that he titled his autobiography Naturalist rather than theoretical biologist or something like that. But really, the main point I wanted that I was thinking about as you were talking there is in terms of what is natural history and all these different things and where we cast our attention, and what are the motivations, like you said, that as far as like the self-interest of humans. But I think that I don't think there's anything about that negates the value of it or makes it not natural history. In fact, if we look back, centuries and millennia ago, a lot of the practice of natural history was about figuring out where food animals were or when fruits would ripen or whatever. But so that doesn't in and of itself negate the respect and the empathy that we've been talking so much about. And then also the question, thinking of like getting scopes inside our bodies and is that natural history? But I think the technologies of tools that we use to heighten our observational capacities has always been part of the practice too. So we have, whether it's just, a good pair of binoculars, which is a miraculous tool, or some kind of scope or more technologically sophisticated tool that we might have. So it's, I think, still part of the same sort of continuum. So as we, I think we all here are familiar, everyone on the session here, I'm sure familiar with the term field marks that we use as naturalists, the field mark of an organism, of wing bars on a bird or whatever it might be. But I was just wondering, can you, do you have any thoughts on what might be the field marks of sort of elegant theory, like theory that is worthy of our time, and what is it? What kind of theory is beautiful and useful?
I think the bottom line for theory is, does it make successful predictions? And it's so you test your understanding of how something works according to your current model by seeing if under a new circumstance your organism or your system will respond in the predicted direction. And if not, why not? So I really love the quote, Alfred North Whitehead's quote of seek simplicity and mistrust it. I think a field mark of great theory is it's simple and clear, but it is also permeable to modification or being completely revamped. And that maybe is more in the job of the scientist than the theory. The theory is the creation, but maybe it needs to be either rewoven or just discarded. in light of new evidence, but often it's a reweaving.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
an understanding, and then so I see three bodies of theory just corresponding to the three axes in which we can perceive life. One is energy flow or nutrient flow, material flow. Another is time, and another is space. And the fundamental ecological theories that have persisted and morphed into lots of interesting forms, but the spatial one is like island biogeography. And then the temporal one is probably intermediate disturbance and disturbance succession, Joe Connell and all of the successional ecologists. Then the food chain is, how tall are the food chains? What determines where resources pile up and where a tiny bit of biomass supports a much larger biomass of consumers. So it's that material flow, which is just mass balance. It's just input minus output equals change in storage. It works at all scales, including if we have been sitting around in COVID and eating too much. But it also, of course, works in whether the world looks green or barren, depending on if the algae is accruing or if it's getting sucked immediately into grazers and the grazers are producing salmon, or what's the fate of all of this. So that then you can put two things together and that becomes even more exciting. And so there a very good theorist at UC Davis, Alan Hastings, did fundamental theory about predators chasing prey through patchy environments, and the prey has to just disperse this much faster than the predator, this much is scaled to their life histories and all that, to persist. And so that was first worked out with oranges in crates, right? Huffackers and a little predatory mite that was chasing a little fruit-eating mite through this arena, and he used everything from Vaseline to his wife's laundry lint to try to make dispersal different. And finally, he managed to arrange so that they could persist with the right adjusted dispersals. Well, that also could explain how fish persist on a floodplain, that you have a great big river like the Fly River in New Guinea is where this occurred to me, with predators in it. And it's well oxygenated, but then there are these off-channel pools that are full of rotting vegetation, and they're pretty anoxic except for the very top layer. So they only support very tolerant fish or the little guys that can surface respire. But every once in a while, the lakes get tipped into the channel because there could be local rain, but the channel still stays low, so they siphon off, and that's where the predators get a chance to eat. And then it can go the other way, and that's what builds the pools. But that exchange keeps the prey and the predators in the system, and the theoretical outcome is stability, which everybody wants as a goal. But the reason is that you just have these arenas with terrified little prey being chased by predators that are hungry, and it applies to any system, from mites to fish to wildebeest perhaps. So so theory helps you generalize among systems and then predict what's going to happen when the world changes, and say temperature warms up the dynamics or changes the performance of one thing but not the other.
So we might say that an elegant theory is one which is simple. Back to Alfred North Whitehead, I think that's a great, very pertinent quote, and useful in being able to help us with prediction, but also in stimulating, thinking and ideas about, extrapolating out from the specific case at hand.
And theory could help you do better natural history.
Right.
If it doesn't blind you, if you don't really love the theory more than the reality,
Right.
then it will make you measure all the right things, like what controls the growth rate of the resource organism, as well as the growth rate of the population you're focusing on, and as well as the risk across a landscape. So you have a model of everything that is important to survival or the passage of material up a food chain or whatever. And it makes you, so it makes you do the accounting to make sure you're measuring everything important.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, so it's a very kind of iterative process, and they're sort of reinforcing one another, as long as you say, that it don't get so attached to the theory that we blind ourselves to empirical realities that might contradict it. Which, of course, there's many examples of that as well.
Yeah.
Well, I want to turn to that. We're starting to get some questions and or comments here, and we don't have a whole lot of time left. So I want to kind of honor the curiosities coming up in the from the audience here. So first we have from James Erdman. Hello, James. It says, based on this discussion, it seems like natural history is perhaps the same as, quote, basic science versus applied science. Are there distinctions, or are they nested?
Yeah, I think I don't see a strong distinction between basic and applied science, to be honest. I think there used to be one, especially in American science, but fundamental science is useful in many cases, and solving problems can lead to basic discovery. So I think, though, maybe natural history is the observational stage that comes in maybe Tyson's sequence. That's the respect stage, but it's also Luna Leopold, who is a famous river geomorphologist and a friend of ours here in Berkeley up till his death, and the son of Aldo Leopold, you know. He talked about what you do, and this goes back to Panama and Bill helping me, you map. If you say you don't know, but Luna had a phase that preceded that. He said, first there's the canoe phase. You don't have a field book out. You put your pencil away. You canoe around and look at stuff and let it flow into you. So that's a natural history phase where your intuition is built and your curiosity is stimulated. And then say you still don't have an idea, then you quantify it, what you can in so maybe you can start seeing some patterns in data, maps, or time series.
Which is just a more formal way of doing the descriptive.
It is.
Natural
It's
history.
just a quantitative.
Yeah.
Would you call it quantitative natural history? Sometimes it's more fun
Sure.
just to look at the bird, but you could count, the
how many birds are there in the flock?
Whatever.
Yeah.
And then you start getting ideas, and the ideas are probably likely going to be general beyond, fixing this problem in this river, like how high can a salmon jump? Is this culvert going to be a barrier? Or is this waterfall going to change the whole life history so that we expect strong year classes under these flood regimes and not under those flood regimes? And all these fundamental things solve applied problems, like how to fix your culverts, but they also predict the future under climate change and projecting fish population dynamics.
Right. Yeah. So natural history is the gathering of the empirical information on which theory can be built. Okay, thank you, James, for the question. Ashley Wolf has asked, how do we ever know that we respect and or understand enough to intervene? Asking as an aspiring ecological restoration practitioner. Great question. How do we assure ourselves that we are being respectful enough before we do anything?
Yeah, I think, well, there are two things to respect. One is previous work in your system, and then the other, of course, is what nature's going to do. I think sometimes there are mistakes that are preventable. For example, when Mysis shrimp are not native to our Western lakes, but they were introduced as fish forage into Flathead Lake and into Lake Tahoe, and they made a mess in both places. And it was because their vertical migration, every day the shrimp go down to the depths where the fish can't find them. And then at night they rise and they eat the little zooplankton. And so they were intended as food for kokanee, but kokanee never saw them. And then when they came up at night, they ate the baby zooplankton, the little zooplankton that the kokanee fry needed. So the kokanee went extinct when they were supposed to get fed. So that was a case where there was insufficient respect to previous work, because the vertical and to the natural history of the shrimp. But
because that was all known before.
It was all known.
Yeah.
It was all known.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing that there's a huge amount of work in restoration that can be applied. And, you know, I think this is more basic, but you don't use big wood to restore rivers where you're going to get huge amounts of sand moving in, because the wood will just get buried. So you may be in a place where there's too much sediment load, or there's too flat a gradient, or too depositional habitat. So you can judge that by looking at the geomorphic setting in the landscape, slope and gradient, and also the sediment supplies, and seeing what the sources of problems are before you jump in. And I think a lot of good restoration is done with that kind of vigilance these days. But when we see mistakes, they can come from things that could have been anticipated better. But I think your attitude of humility is extremely well taken, and will only be helpful.
Yeah, bravo for that.
Yeah.
Okay. Sylvia Rains Dennis says, love how you describe functional and observational patterns that have relevance on many spheres of research, and indeed offer a chance at comprehension inclusive of cascades, flows, cycles, spirals, as well as leading to detailed exploratory scientific study. To me, favoring respect and connectivity as opposed to imposing an expectation or a model always seems the beginning of learning and interrelationship. Thank you for your clarity and engagement with these ideas.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Yeah.
We agree.
Very nicely articulated. Thank you.
Yeah.
From Albert Vidal, asks, how optimistic are you about the future of natural history, both as a field and practice? Are technology and screens mostly disconnecting society further from nature, or may easier access to knowledge and places maintain or even increase the interest of future generations in the amazing natural world?
Oh, Albert is a colleague at Berkeley, so thank you for coming. I hope the latter is true. But I don't think a screen can take the place of being out there. So Albert actually gets stream ecology students into a creek on campus looking at bugs, and I think that's much more rewarding for them than a nature program would be. But the nature programs are brilliant. And when you consider at least the photographers are getting exposed to nature there because of the huge amount of time and hard and dangerous work they have to do to get the footage they see. So I think a lot of marine ecologists were certainly inspired by Jacques Cousteau in my generation, the scuba diving. And so we just definitely have to couple that with the sort of expeditions that Tom Fleischner is talking about, getting them to Southern Oregon in a raft, and then there's also, there's a very good book on this, Last Child in the Woods. And it's a shame that parents are scared to let their kids run free in nature. They may not be wrong to be cautious about that, but it would be wonderful if there were places that kids could be safe, or if they were at risk, their only risk would be breaking a leg or something. And I believe that life wasn't that safe in the 50s when we got to run around until it was 10 p.m. and getting dark at night. the 50, I have another colleague at Berkeley talked about doing that in Southern California, and she kept hiding behind the big boulders in the hillsides there from these weird looking people that were dressed in black up in the hills. And it turned out that she was playing hide and seek and never let herself get caught with the Manson family. So the difference these days is it's televised, so all the parents are terribly frightened, and probably there is more danger, at least from traffic and stuff. But it's I think, Albert, that it's really important that we save woodlots for kids to have adventures in and let them have enough freedom to have those adventures.
Yeah, I might just jump in too, because Albert's question is one that I've thought a lot about as well. And my first response was, well, the answer is yes. The overemphasis on screen time is very much of a problem.
I agree.
Good friend of mine, Laura Sewell, who's an ecopsychologist, has written about our actual visual perception changes when we're always looking at a two-dimensional rather than a three-dimensional world. We're looking at a two-dimensional thing that's the same distance. There's actual perceptual problems with it, not and many other problems as well. And it also can be a great tool. And I think the Jacques Cousteau example is a good one, that this is not a new thing. And there's a world of information at our fingertips. So I think it's about kind of finding the right sort of balance between those, and not letting the screen time be the only reality that we're dealing with. Okay, and I think we got one more, and then that might be our time. This is from Chuck Rowe. Hello, Chuck and Charlotte. He says, Charlotte is interested in your thoughts about the loss of strong university programs to educate and inspire biologists and ecologists who are comfortable in the field, not just in the lab. A wonderful ornithologist, now retired, assured me he would definitely not be replaced by another ornithologist or other field zoologist. He explained that departments in R1 schools are often rewarded for recruiting faculty who can bring in huge grants. He said he had chosen behavioral ornithology because he loved field work and wanted to spend more time in the field and teaching than writing grants. Similarly, the botanists here are largely gone. They're now occupied by scientists who use simplified plant systems in the lab and never take students into the field. Little wonder that there's not much advocacy for the environment in our legislature. Nature centers and botanical gardens are part of the solution, but I wonder whether we can ever bring back the sense of wonder and natural history to our universities.
That's an excellent point. And I was very disturbed when I got out on the job market just to hear about all of the ologists, the ornithologists, herpetologists, they were being let go. And our friends, we put up some friends from our graduate school who were interviewing in molecular developmental biology, and they came back shaken and disturbed by exactly the observation that the molecular biologists were rubbing their hands together over getting rid of all these old ologies and getting more cell biology. And so it's still a problem. Building the constituency should get more attention, as epidemic disease reminds us of how important ecology is, and as global warming demands address. And I just hope it can happen fast enough. But I am concerned about the loss of respect, and then the loss of knowledge of the diversity in a salt marsh as compared to what the model plants are doing in the greenhouse. It's a
yeah.
I think we just have to keep fighting fiercely.
Yeah. And I think Chuck and Charlotte, thank you for the question. And
thank you, Chuck.
It's I'll just add that I think I am cautiously optimistic myself, as one who's been sort of advocating for the sort of renaissance of natural history, and have seen some change in the right direction. And I think in many ways, large universities, by their very nature of being huge bureaucracies and so on, tend to be slower to change than some other smaller colleges, and just things from outside. So I think they catch up and I've seen a lot of change just in the last decade or so, of sort of a regrowing of receptivity to the value of natural history, and that all these kind of things we're talking about. And obviously, I'm talking to you, Mary, it's never been gone from big research universities completely, but it is a concern. I also might mention that the Natural History Institute has, this is kind of our purpose in being, is to sort of help foster this kind of renaissance in the delight and wonder of natural history. And also we were involved in some projects, some of which partially funded by the National Science Foundation, just about 5 years ago. And so there's a part of the Natural History Institute website called Promoting Field Studies. And there's a lot of resources there that you can get to look at some of this, including a paper we did in bioscience and so on the importance of teaching biology in the field. And so I think there is some change in that regard, and it's really important that, as Mary says, that we kind of keep things going.
It is absolutely invaluable that you're doing this and leading this, Tom. I really thank you for that.
Thank you. And it looks like I think Jesse just put that link to that part of the website up. So Mary, maybe last question, just a quick question is, can you just share with us just some cool natural history observation or experience you've had in this week sometime, or anything that's just drawn your attention?
Well, we had what Bill and I called bird TV outside our kitchen window. So I put we had a tragedy that a Buick's wren tried to make a nest in a flue in our chimney, and we actually were having the chimney in the house painted, but the painters were so gentle and so respectful that the little chicks kept squeaking and nothing happened until the painters went away. And then we found the metal door pried open and the nest evacuated. I'm sure the chicks got eaten, and I think a squirrel got them. So then I immediately bought some birdhouses, and I didn't put them up all that skillfully, but one of them is about a foot away from our kitchen window. And it got investigated this time by a chickadee. I'd intended them for the Buick's wrens to make amends, but the chickadee investigated, and then it kept bouncing in and out and in and out and in and out of a male and a female both did this. And then when they spent time inside the little house, they started drumming and hammering it like little woodpeckers. And it would sound like a snare drum on the roof and like a bongo drum on the side. And so I mentioned this to Jane Hirschfield, and she had a friend who studies chickadees. And I said, yes, that's real. They want to get all the germs from the previous occupant out, and they're actually happier if you put some litter inside so they can evacuate it and get the cooties out of their home before they build their nest. So,
that's great.
So we were watching this activity. It was very, very funny.
That's great. That's great. Well, no, never an end. One of the wonderful things about being a naturalist, whether it's a bird watcher or a botanist or all of the above, any and everything else in between, is that there's never any reason to ever be bored again in your life. There's always something to check out and to nurture you and sort of rekindle your love of the world, and of course in these sort of trying times we've been living through recently, I think that's ever as important as it's ever been. So, Mary Power, thank you so much for making time to be here with us this evening. It's just been a delight talking with you. Thank you for your years-long support of the work of the Natural History Institute. And thank you to everyone for making time out of your busy lives to share this evening with us.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for your friendship.
Yeah,
and for the Institute.
Absolutely. And so again, I just will mention that the This session will be on the Natural History Institute YouTube channel immediately, but in a slightly edited version as of tomorrow morning. So feel free to share it with others as well. And while you're doing that, we invite you to subscribe to that YouTube channel. There's all sorts of great stuff on there. And hope to see some of you at the programs coming up for the next couple of weeks as well. So with that, I want to honor everybody's busy lives and not take up too much more of your time. So we'll close for now. And again, thank you, Mary, and thank you to everyone here tonight.